Today I'll be going over the quiz review for targets 1 through 5. Target 1, we are working on identifying whether something is a rational equation or whether it is a rational graph. Remember, our rational equations are always in the form of p of x over q of x. So we're looking for a polynomial that could be in the top or in the denominator. But really we need to make sure in our equations we have an x in the denominator. So it says circle which of the following equations represent a rational. A represents a rational because of the x in the denominator. B does not because x is in the numerator only and not in that denominator. C is, again, we have x in the denominator. And D is not because x is not in the denominator. It has to be listed down there. When we look for graphs, remember our graph here is a hyperbola. So we're always looking to have two branches that are formed using our vertical and horizontal asymptotes. I can tell B is not one because it only has one graph. A, C, and D are all going to be rational functions. All of them have our two branches that are approaching those asymptotes. Target 2, I'm looking for the constant of variation. Remember, you do need to have that formula memorized for the test, or sorry, for the quiz. That formula is y equals k over x. K is our constant of variation. So for each one of these, we need to plug a point in for x and y to solve for k. On A, you can pick any perfect point you see on the graph. I see 2, 2 as a perfect point. So I'm going to plug 2 in for y, and I'm going to plug 2 in for x. Then I'm going to solve for k. So to solve for k, I multiply both sides by 2, and I get k is equal to 4. On b, we don't need to solve. It's already in the form y equals k over x. I can see my k here is a negative 2. C is similar to A where I need to plug it in the formula, but they have already told me my x and my y. So I have y equals, so negative 2 equals k over x, where x is negative 4. To get k by itself, I'll multiply both sides by negative 4. So k equals a positive 8. On D, we're given points. We're just given several points. You can pick any point you want to use. I'm going to pick the point in the middle, 5, 1, because it doesn't have a fraction and they're both positive. So remember, f of x is the same thing as y. So we'll have 1 equals k over 5. Multiplying both sides by 5, I know k equals 5. On the back side, we have target 3 and 4 combined together here. We need to find our horizontal and vertical asymptotes as long with our domain and range, and then go ahead and graph. Remember, for your horizontal asymptote, you always have to have an equation y equals. It will always equal the number that is being added or subtracted from the end of your fraction. For vertical asymptotes, we always have x equals, and we're always looking at the denominator, and we're setting it equal to 0. So if I have x plus 4 equals 0, I'll subtract 4, and x equals negative 4. When I think of domain and range, remember domain has to do with what x values I can use. Well, I know at x equals negative 4, I have a vertical asymptote, so I can't have any x values on negative 4. So my domain is going to be all real numbers, except x can't equal 4. For my range, I know my range is my y values. We found our horizontal asymptote to be negative 3, so I know I won't have any y values on that line. So my range is going to be all real numbers, but y can't equal negative 3. When I go to graph this, I like to split it up into two tables because I know I'm going to have two sides to my graph, one on the left-hand side of the asymptote, one on the right-hand side of my asymptote. So I'll start with finding my x values that will give me these two sides. I always want to pick my x values according to that vertical asymptote. So I know my vertical asymptotes here at -4. So to the left of -4, I would have -5. I might choose -6, and then some other number to the left. So I'm going to do -8. For the right-hand side of my graph, I want to be right to the right of -4. So I'm going to start with -3. I'm going to do -2, and then how about 0? I'm going to plug these into my calculator. Remember, we have to be very careful when we plug this into our calculator. You need to make sure your entire denominator is in parentheses. So in my calculator, I would do 6 divided by, in parentheses, -5 plus 4, and that parentheses, minus 3. And we'll have to continue to do that for each one of our x values. When I plug in -5, I get -9. When I plug in -6, I get -6. When I plug in -8, I get -4.5. When I plug in -3, I get 3. When I plug in -2, I get 0. When I plug in 0, I get -1.5. So now we're going to go ahead and graph these. So remember, each table there represents one of my branches. So on the left-hand side, I have -5 at -9. So -5 is my x value, -9 is my y value. Sorry, just graph that at -7. For my next point, I have -6, -6. And then I have -8, -4.5. Our graphs are always going to be curves. They're always getting closer and closer to those asymptotes. On the right-hand side, then, I have a point at -3, 3, -2, 0, 0, -1.5. Again, connecting those points as a curve and getting closer to my asymptote. Okay, let's look at B. So again, in B, the first thing it wants is my horizontal asymptote. Remember to write that as an equation. So it's y equals always the number we add or subtract from the outside. So 5. Remember, that is going to help me find my range because my range uses my y values. Tells me my range is all real numbers except for y can't equal 5. Go ahead and put that on my graph too. And I have my horizontal asymptote of 5. For my vertical asymptote, again, it's an x equals. I'm going to take my denominator. So I have x minus 1 equals 0. So we get x equals a positive 1. That's going to help me with my domain because I know my domain is all real numbers. But x can't equal that positive 1. So that will give us our other asymptote. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make my two tables. So my first table, to make my first branch, I'm going to do it as the left-hand side. So remember, that means I want to the left-hand side of my asymptote. So I'm going to start at 0. I'll do -1, and then how about -5? For my second branch, I'm going to go to the right of that asymptote. So the first thing I'm going to start at there is 2. I'm going to do 2, 3, and 8. Then we take each one of those x values and we plug it into our equation. Just like the first one, we have to be careful. You need to put that denominator in parentheses. So when I plug in 0, I get a positive 8. When I plug in -1, I get 6.5. At -5, I got 5.5. Plug in 2, I get 2. 3, I get a 3.5. And 8, I get 4.57. I'm going to go ahead and graph these two branches. So at 0, I'm up at 8. -1, I'm at 6.5. -2, I'm at 5.5. So we're approaching that asymptote. Remember, you never want to cross that asymptote. For my right branch, I'm starting at 2, 2. Then I have 3, 3.5. And 8, I'm up at 4.57. So again, connect your points in a curve and approach those asymptotes. The last target that will be on your quiz is target number 5. So target number 5, we're trying to match the rational equation to the graph. I would always recommend finding your asymptotes first. So I'm going to go through and find my horizontal and my vertical asymptote. My vertical asymptote here, setting the denominator equal to 0, is 3. My horizontal asymptote, since I'm not adding anything to the outside, would be 0. In the second one, my vertical asymptote would be 0, setting x equal to 0. My horizontal asymptote is going to be y equals a positive 3. For number 3, my vertical asymptote, setting the denominator equal to 0, I get negative 3. My horizontal asymptote is also at negative 3. And number 4, setting my denominator equal to 0, I get positive 3. And my horizontal asymptote is again negative 3. When we look at the graphs, we can tell where the asymptotes are by where the lines are approaching. So if I look at graph A, I know I have a horizontal asymptote here at 3 because my graphs are approaching 3 but not touching 3. And then I have a vertical asymptote here at 0. So that tells me that 2 is going to be graph A. For B, my graph is getting closer and closer to y equals negative 3. And it's getting closer to that vertical asymptote here, which is also at negative 3. So that tells me that number 3 is going to be B. If I look at C, my vertical asymptote is getting closer to 3, and my horizontal asymptote is at 0. So I have a horizontal asymptote of 0, vertical asymptote of 3. That has to be number 1. Last but not least, on D, I have a vertical asymptote here at positive 3. I have a horizontal asymptote at negative 3. So 4 has to be graph D. If you have any questions, please come in and ask.